Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living Ancestor Podcast. This is your host, Ramon Castellanos, coming from Eating Ancient Virtue. And today's podcast is going to be a deep dive into alchemical models of health and illness. Now, what that means at a core level is that we're going to step back and take a big picture perspective of the healing process. And we're going to take that healing process and map it in a way that is fundamentally based in alchemy. Now, this is not just theoretical. It has emerged from my own practice in my own life and in counseling other people. Now, for those of you who don't know, something like 7 or 8 years ago, I got very sick and my system broke down in a variety of ways. This was at a nervous system level. I was having heart trouble, digestive issues, joint problems, overall just shut down. And that's not including the congenital abnormality that I was born with in my pituitary gland. And for those of you who don't know, the pituitary is what's called the master gland, and it sits inside your skull. And without going into too much detail, because it's not really that important, my pituitary gland doesn't function the way that is considered normal. So there is an abnormality. I would personally not call it a illness or a disease in its own right. I'm just shaped a little differently, so to speak. But one of the effects from that fundamentally is that it suppresses all of the hormones to some degree or another that rely on the pituitary gland. And that's actually a lot of them. About 80% of the hormones in your body have some kind of feedback loop with the pituitary. This led to me getting testosterone replacement therapy when I was just 13 years old to jumpstart my puberty. And this was, of course, led by an endocrinologist and the official channels, so to speak. But at this stage in my life, I do not take hormone replacement therapy and have not since that period when I was a child. And what this means is that I have had a lot of direct experience with engaging a body that is not functioning the way that most people want their body to function, which is normally. And at the same time, I have taken a very active approach of getting into my body as much as I possibly can. So there's been a deep current of the spirituality of the body and of embodiment as a whole in my life and in my direct experience. So there's more I can say about my process. If I gave people the history of what I've dealt with on a physical level, most people would be like, whoa, that's quite a bit. And it is. But with that said, also, it's given me a very distinct perspective, I think. It's distinct in my opinion on how to approach healing in a way that is anchored into something more deeply, one could say, spiritual, quote unquote, for a lack of a better all encompassing word in the English language that points us towards a particular orientation, which is that in this way, when we approach health, healing, and illness, it can be a catalyst in our path to move us towards greater wholeness, towards greater spiritual virtue, towards a deeper orientation in our lives, anchored in the direction of the soul, and also, of course, to make us more healthier, more vital, more vibrant, and more capable of pursuing the things that matter to us in life. With that said, matter as a word is important here because alchemy, in this way, to quote James Hillman, is the redemption of matter. So I think it's important to place that specific quote in the context that Western alchemy, which is going to be one of the core pillars of the alchemical modeling that we're going to be exploring in what I teach going forward with this material, because I do want to do several podcasts about this. And holding that context in place, Western alchemy evolved in Western culture. And Western culture has within it certain biases that fundamentally do the opposite of the redemption process of working with matter. In some senses, they demean matter. So, Western culture, of course, obviously deeply influenced by the books of the Abrahamic tradition, right? So, the Bible, and so we have Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Catholicism. These are core frameworks inside of how Western culture orientates. Even modern scientific Western enlightened culture, so to speak, is deeply influenced by those traditions because science evolved, modern science as we have come to understand it, evolved in the hands of people who were monotheistic practitioners of those traditions. So, because of that, this idea of moving away from matter, of separating matter and spirit, of deanimating, that is, removing the spirit out of the material, and ascension based, transcendent based orientations that move us away from physicality are all a part of what the Western body is dealing with. And all those things have moved themselves into Western medicine. And the way that Western medicine orientates. We're going to dive more deeply into that as we progress. But in this way, alchemy is a way that, for one, many different systems of ancient medicine were alchemical. So when we look at this from an ancestral perspective, we see that our ancestors were relating to the body and to the healing process, not just the body, but the being inside the body, the soul that's interfacing with the body, all of it alchemically. So that's an important consideration. But more so, that alchemy is redemption of matter in the sense that the ancient alchemist inside of Western culture were dealing with this mind body spirit matter split in a way that was very overt because the church had a lot of power at that point. And they were working with matter in a way that was different because for them, for the alchemist, the process of working with matter was not separate from the process of working with the soul. So in this way already, when they were in their laboratories, when they were heating up materials, when they were purifying those materials, when they were shaping those materials, they were also creating a resonant and sympathetic link with the being on the inside, with the soul. So working with matter was considered by its very nature a soulful practice. It was already a direct link between spirit and matter. And with that said also, the redemption of matter in this way reorientates our language and how we relate to the process of working with the body, because the body is matter. Fundamentally, it is material. But now take a look at a lot of what is in modern Western culture when it comes to health and illness. It's language that's very conceptualized, very etheric. It's about these chemicals that we can't directly relate to. It's about these processes that are doing this. It's about laboratory studies and double-blind things. And those aspects can have value, no doubt about it, right? There's value that can come from those models, from those frameworks, from those experiments and theories, from the laboratory stuff, from the conceptualizations, from working at the micro scale of theoretical chemical interactions, all of that. But as you notice, none of that actually is similar to what is discussed in alchemy. And I already mentioned some of that. It's important to understand that alchemy came from arts that had to do with the hands, with craft, with artisanship, with getting into it, so to speak, right? Pottery, metallurgy, perfume making, leather work, woodworking, even in some context. So what you were looking at were systems of working with the material that we're very actively engaged with and discuss, again, heating something up, cooking it, purifying it, dissolving it, coagulating it, smoothing it out, setting it in place, changing it in very physical ways, in very active ways, in very engaged ways. So, what that means for us is that if we place health and illness into an alchemical model, for one, it redeems matter in the sense that the body itself and the healing process cannot be separated from the being who's inside of it. It also means that as we're working with the body in very palpable ways, so grounded work, that we're also working with the being on the inside. And then also, when we're working with the being on the inside, we're working with the material. So, alchemical models of health and illness come back in a time now when they are needed most. And they still exist unbroken in systems of medicine like Taoist medicine, or what people think of as traditional Chinese medicine. They're not exactly the same, but they are, of course, coming from the same overall tradition, from Ayurvedic medicine, from Tibetan medicine, from these kinds of medicines that were elemental. Yeah, they were thinking about things like fire and water and metal and wood and wind, these material substances that are in the body, that are changing, that are transmuting, that are transforming, that are going through cycles and phases, which is the kind of orientation that we're going to look at here. However, I'm not going to rely on any single system of medicine for what we're going to discuss, because that's not truly the point of this. What I want to do is actually step back and give a meta model of orientation that you can put any kind of system of medicine into and actually mix and combine different systems of medicine together to make this shift in your own personal practice. So, now that we've gotten the introduction out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. So, the first orientation I'm going to invite you to consider is that the language of nature is alchemical. So, what does that mean? Well, nature is constantly communicating. So, at a bigger level of the macrocosmic scale of the universe, we have the heat of the sun that makes it through our atmosphere, that comes and starts to, let's say, fall upon the earth. And right now I'm looking outside my window and there's grass with sun on it. So the sun's heat is communicating with the soil, that's communicating then with the seeds that are in it, that combined with water starts to create plant life, for example. That is a communication network. There is at a deeper level an alchemical process being communicated. Heat, a basic aspect of alchemy is working with heat, with fire. Yeah. And that fire is creating a process inside of this vessel, which could be both the soil and the seeds. Both of them could be thought of as vessels. Again, vessels also are a part of the alchemical process. We stick things in vessels. Yeah, and in that way, the body itself is a vessel also. And so that then creates a process. And that process eventually comes into being with plant life. One simple example. The rain cycle is potentially another example of this, where water will evaporate, it'll move into the clouds, it'll coagulate again, then condense, come down, go into the different parts of nature, and then on and on. You're seeing a transmutative cycle of water in nature. So if we were then to step back and notice that the body itself is also nature, it is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the natural world. And what that means is that the body is inherently already an alchemical process. So the brain is communicating with different organs are communicating with each other. There is this ongoing feedback process. Things are being transformed and transmuted on a continuous basis. We're taking in oxygen that gets combusted inside the cell to eventually become energy. It has to also mix with fuel from food in order to do that. Food is another great example of the alchemical process. We're taking in something like a steak, or for people who are into vegetables and things like that, kale or whatever. And we're eating that, chewing it up, and moves through the body. It starts to get acted upon by enzymes that are nuclear in scope. They transmute the matter that then we extract, and then we absorb nutrients and excrete the waste. That's an alchemical process. So the language of nature is fundamentally alchemical. Nature is constantly in communication. It does this through an energetic language. It does this through things like heat, like pressure, magnetism, electricity, timing, all of these layers that are fundamentally energetic in scope. And the body is a microcosm of nature because it evolved in the natural world. It is made up of the same materials as the natural world, yes. And it also is this vast ecosystem that is moving through alchemical cycles. And ancient systems of medicine, they understood this, they knew this, and they codified this process. When you look at Chinese medicine, for example, it's based on yin and yang. So light and dark, hot and cold, open and closed, as well as the 5-element cycle of Chinese medicine, which goes from earth to metal to water to wood to fire. When you're thinking about it in a creation cycle, you could reverse that order or connect that order in different diagonal patterns to look at different relationships of the elemental forces. And in this way, the organs themselves are recognized to be related to these elements. So the stomach and spleen is connected to the earth element, the lungs and the large intestine are connected to the metal element, and so on it goes. So the body already in this way in ancient systems of medicine, in this case Chinese medicine, perceived the body to be an elemental being, yeah, who you could not separate the spirit from. So in this case too, the spleen and the stomach have a shen, or what is referred to as a kind of spirit, a consciousness that was bequeathed upon us by our ancestors. But it does have a consciousness, and that consciousness has a personality and a way of acting in the system. So the spleen stomach is responsible for certain aspects of the human function, of the human personality function, right? What makes us even a human animal, a human creature. The same could be said for all of the different organs. They all have a spirit, and that spirit is a part of the function of the personality of the being in question. So you cannot separate out the consciousness of the organ from the consciousness of you and how you function as a being. And you cannot separate that out from the elemental aspects that then also point us out towards the reality that we are a continuous alchemical function and process that is elemental and also that is spirit at a core level. So all of these things are interrelated to one another. Whereas modern medicine, modern systems of medicine, they perceive the being to be primarily chemical and mechanical, the system as a machine. And in this way, you can easily divorce the being on the inside from the mechanical parts of the body, so to speak. Now, I say this tongue-in-cheek, honestly, because the whole machine metaphor idea, which I've spoken about before, is completely inaccurate. The body has no mechanisms inside of it, for one, and the body is not a machine, and it's not a computer, and it's not any of those things. And I won't go into depth about why that is. I'll talk about that more in the future. I've already talked about that before on my podcast. If you're interested in going into this a little bit more, you can check out my Elder Fire podcast that I did on this topic called, we are not machines, remembering what it means to be human. But you'll see this. You see a lot of people talking about the mechanism by which a particular thing acts, or in a more overt way, literally an organ transplant, which is cool that that can be done. But as you'll notice, rarely is any energy given towards the spirit of that organ and what that means, putting in somebody else's organ spirit into our system. And there's plenty of research that says that taking in somebody else's organs can definitely affect who you are as a person. But that's not really codified into how we perceive that medicine. It's just like a mechanic looking at a carburetor that's broken inside of a car. We just take out your heart and put in another one, on it goes. Or the idea that we can cut off somebody's head and stick it onto somebody else's body and that they would be the exact same person because consciousness is just a process of the brain, for example. So it's that kind of thinking where we can divorce the inner being from what's going on in their matter that is at the core of how Western medicine tends to work, and it's also at the core of a lot of the health advice that's out there. And take these supplements, do these things, practice these protocols like you're just some kind of machine that's trying to optimize a set of levers and functions, instead of a deeper practice of orientation where those things are known to also be cool, that you can maybe work with them, but that will require certain kinds of interchange as well. So with that said, we are a multi-layered system that's moving through transformative and transmutative phases. So multi-layered meaning, there is of course the organs, we were just discussing, the organ spirits. There's our ancestral inheritance. There's the environment that we exist within. There's the soul and the soul's calling and how that relates to the particular body that you have and what it's currently doing. There's the way that all of that interacts with itself, and that's all creating transformative and transmutative cycles. And so disease process is a transformative and transmutative event occurring inside the body. And why is that happening? Well, it can happen for a lot of different reasons, and we're going to start to move into that. But one of the things that we're going to discuss is disease as a kind of fragmentation and a kind of split inside the system. And I'll get into a lot of detail about what I mean by that. But that's going to be a core thing. So stepping back, then health is about making the system whole or balanced. So if disease is a kind of transmutative and transformative process taking place inside the body, and we are an alchemical process as a whole, that means that we have to engage a different kind of transmutative and transformative process to shift the disease state in a particular direction. And that direction is one that leads us towards greater wholeness, integrity, and what we could even call balance. Now, a lot of us instinctively know that balance is a core part of what it means to be healthy and vital. This was layered into ancient systems of medicine, and even today, when people discuss homeostasis, we recognize that balance between the different elements of the system, this is even in Western medicine, that we have to balance things out, is core. But what is balance? Balance is two different aspects of a spectrum called yin and yang, yes, coming into harmony with one another. What that means is that instead of them being split from another and at war or clashing, they are harmonized. They are made, what is the word, my friends? Whole. There is integrity. Balance and wholeness and integrity are all related to one another, yeah? So, with that said, let's go ahead and move into the notion of disease and fragmentation. Now, there's a principle in osteopathic medicine that disease is a gift that's keeping the system together. Now, from one standpoint, what the hell does that mean? Well, if we step back and we look at the multi-layered system we were just discussing, then we can start to notice how some kind of split or fragmentation somewhere in the system is responsible for the overwhelming majority of what we would consider disease process. And that is at the way, okay, so let me step back. The disease process occurs in the body in order to tie together elements in the system and it's in the system's relationship to the whole that would break apart if the disease was not present. So it would literally be tearing you apart if those things weren't occurring, if the disease wasn't occurring. So in order to understand what that principle is discussing, think about it this way. You are an individual body with a bunch of different aspects inside of you. So all of the different organs and what the organs are doing, what they came into being with in terms of the organ spirits that you received from your ancestors. That system exists inside of an environment, and that environment has location in terms of geography and time and space. There's the temperatures that you're surrounded by. There's the house that you're in, so the actual living space could be full of any number of things that could be either helpful or harmful to your health. There's the cultural patterns and the transpersonal patterns that human beings are constantly dealing with. So it doesn't matter what culture you're from. If you were raised inside of a culture, you have adopted certain kinds of orientations. Now, if you remember, if you think of the organs as beings that have a personality and are responsible for part of your personality, that means that whatever beliefs they have to absorb alters how they function. Yeah. So in some ways, our organs are being shaped by what our culture tells us to inhabit and perceive. There's the inner splits that occur inside. So maybe the lungs and the kidneys don't want to communicate with each other, which is actually a very common theme in different kinds of medicine, where organs will literally be at odd ends with other organs. Then there's also these karmic layers, possibly, if you start to extract the essence of the being out from just this body in this time and this place, and you look at a soul's movement potentially across multiple lifetimes, or even just ancestral patterns that are moving through lifetimes, and you have these karmic layers that are present and can be fractally expressed inside the body. So what I mean by that is that possibly something in the body that isn't functioning a certain way could actually not be at all related to this lifetime and be related to something ancestral or a past life layer, for example. And then you have, yes, the personality, that you are, the mind and the psyche and how you orientate and the energetic imbalances that can be created by that. So you have all of these different layers together, and a disease process is happening because aspects of all of this somewhere are fractured from each other. They're not in direct communication with one another in a way that is harmonious and integral, and thus the disease process forms as a way to literally keep the system stitched together. It's almost as if there's a tear or a rip, and the disease is a kind of knitting that occurs in an attempt to hold the system from being torn apart. Yeah? So the disease in this way is actually an intelligent process. And this is a principle that does come from osteopathic medicine too, is that there is an intelligence embedded into the disease process. And you can actually see this in some very interesting ways, where you see adaptations occurring in the body that are meant to deal with a problem that's arising, and there's an intelligence behind it. The body is adapting, but it's adapting in a way that is fundamentally leading towards a disease process, fundamentally. And I don't want to mention any particular disease in this context. I'm not a doctor. This is not meant to treat any particular disease. All of that qualifier is important. It's a way to understand that when we're looking at the system as a whole, all of these layers can come into place. So now let's step back from that and look at some practical examples. So, for example, ancestral patterns. So in my previous podcast, I talked about health, genetics, and ancestral patterns. So there's the larger arc of ancestral patterns that come from tribal and indigenous cultures that have affected who the human creature is. Yeah, our innate design as a species. We evolved in the wilderness, very active lifestyles, eating whole organic seasonal foods in a tribal culture full of lives of meaning and purpose, experiencing different kind of temperature stresses, living in circadian rhythms that were typically aligned with light and dark because we didn't have artificial lighting. All of this stuff that has made it into modern health advice these days, exercise, eat real food, have meaning and purpose, surround yourself with a community, balance your sleep cycle, your sleep and wake cycles, get different kinds of stresses like cold plunges and sauna. All of that is fundamentally just re-ancestralization. Yeah? Because if your ancestors were koalas, then you wouldn't need to sprint to get certain kinds of health benefits, yeah? In fact, it probably wouldn't be good for you if your ancestors were a koala. So there's this idea that like exercises, it's not about because exercise is important for its own sake. It's because our ancestors were exercising. So it means that we are mismatched from our ancestral currents. So that's a split, a fragmentation from the deeper ancestral currents that we come from. So when we're doing those things, that's really just a reintegrating, once again, of the ancestral into our lives. That's a kind of wholeness making. It's a reintegrative process. And once that happens, we change on the inside too. Then, of course, there can be just ancestral patterns in terms of the genetics of our line, because maybe our genetics are more geared towards being susceptible to something like diabetes. So we have to be very conscious, for example, and that is in my line is diabetes. We have to be way more conscious of how we deal with carbohydrate intake and activity levels. For example, that's me acknowledging my line and going, okay, I'm a part of this inheritance. I'm a part of this lineage that has this particular predisposition. So I'm going to reintegrate with that and pay attention to my carbohydrate intake. Something I have to do because that is my fate from an ancestral perspective to have received that. But that could play out in anything. That could play out in pretty much anything we could consider a genetic inheritance for the most part. There are some, potential outliers, and there's always outliers in everything, but that's not the point. Then we step back and we go environmental mismatches. So living in an environment that maybe is not good for your genetics, or for that matter, that there's mold growing in places. And I've noticed this in my own life. I won't pay attention to like the certain parts of my dish rack and it'll get moldy. And if I'm not like consciously paying attention to that, that means that my dishes are getting mold on them, which means then the mold gets into my food, or that there might be mold growing somewhere else, or that you might live under power lines, for example, or that you live in a geography which your genetics do not like, because maybe you come from islander people and you're living in the desert or something like that. You could get way more nuanced with this and start to look into classical feng shui, for example, where you're looking at directional impacts, the furniture that you have around you, etc. But again, that's just a reintegration yet again. Yeah? It's becoming attuned to what's happening around you, where you may exist separate from that, segregated from it. But the disease process shows up and says, hey, something's wrong somewhere in the system. There's a fragmentation. So where's that coming from? Yeah? And how do I reintegrate with my environment and attune myself to what's going on around me? Cultural and transpersonal patterns. There are many different ways in which cultures can be sick, and how certain cultures have more of a particular kind of rate of certain illnesses. This is a pattern that has been discovered over the world, right? That for whatever reason, certain cultures have more of certain kinds of illness. And why is that? Well, could be ancestral, could be environmental, could be some combination of that that's also a personality pattern. We're going to talk more about personality in a little bit, because that's a really important consideration that often doesn't get enough say. Yeah, we'll get there. So some kind of cultural pattern that maybe is at odd ends with the deeper underlying health intelligence of the system that is creating an illness. So then we have to step back and go like, let's do work around this. How do I relate to this cultural pattern? What part of it do I agree with? What part of it do I not agree with? What part of it is authentic? What part of it is inauthentic? What do I have to release and dissolve? What can take its place? People are doing that all of the time these days, right? There's an enormous backdraft of that's going on with gender and race and all of these things. They're culturally embedded patterns that are now coming to the head to be assessed, renegotiated, repatterned. Yeah, that's happening, and these things occur inside of us too. Yeah, we have to contend with these patterns. Then the inner splits and the karmic layers. This is a whole other issue. So the inner splits could be that parts of you, and it's important to recognize that you are a collection of parts that are all either in synchronization with one another or are not. Yeah. And how these different parts feel about things. Because you might have one part that wants to go out and play golf every day, and another part that wants to sit at the computer and work, and another part of you that wants to be with your partner in loving relationship, and another part of you that wants to cheat and go do all of these things, right? These things happen to people all the time where you'll hear them say, that was not me. Well, it is you, actually. It's a part of you that is not usually in control, but these are all different parts that don't just exist in like an ephemeral psyche. If we're going back to the aspect of alchemy, then we're looking again at matter, the redemption of matter, and the link between spirit and matter. So that means that these parts have some kind of correlate inside the body, and that directly working with the body could affect these parts, or directly working with the parts could affect the body. Yeah. And then that means that these splits have to be reckoned with. They have to be seen for what they are. The part of you that does want to, let's say, adopt a reintegration of ancestral patterns into your life, and the part of you that is really deeply embedded into a cultural layer that doesn't, that wants to sit on the couch and eat Cheetos all day and watch, Survivor or whatever. I don't know, right? And these are parts of you that have to be reckoned with. And from an alchemical perspective, some kind of alchemical operation is brought into the mix. And now, what these operations are a talk for a different piece of this, right? Or a different piece of this talk. We'll get there. Then you have the personality and the energetic imbalances that it creates. Again, this is all the same, but the personality is often formed in early childhood for the most part. Also, of course, big events can alter you. So initiatory processes, college can affect things, going to the military, maybe a police academy, accidents, for example, big losses of death and things like that. And family or partners, for that matter, can affect one's personality. But also, of course, the slow, continuous work of disciplines and practices, meditation, qigong, internal alchemy, yoga, mantra practice, getting out and getting into flow states in nature. All of these different kinds of practices that can be done can slowly also alter the personality. But the personality, in this way, is actually responsible for a lot of illness. The character structure that a person holds, the habituated way that we think, that we feel, that we orientate, and the way then that personality distributes energy inside the system, creates splits or integrations, etc. Right? The being on the inside and the way that being is orientating has a lot to do with disease process. So in Chinese medicine, for example, when they give you herbal formulas that are meant to address specific imbalances inside the system, like literally yin and yang imbalances, elemental imbalances, imbalances of heat and cold, one of the things that's continuously recognized is that that's affecting the being too, on the inside, the way that the being is orientated. So someone who's very stressed out, anxious, isn't sleeping well, is having a lot of disturbed dreams, is somebody who's considered to have a disturbed shen or disturbed spirit or too much heat in the system, which then has to do with how they're thinking, how they're processing, how they make decisions, what kind of decisions they're making. And an herbal formula that's meant to come in and address that will slowly change how that being orientates, or is supposed to, because at best then it'll just bandage a problem. Right? So it's meant to be this integrative process that changes the whole of the person in the process. Yeah, and then this is interrelated with energetic imbalances. So too much heat in the system is too much agitation, too much impatience, activation, wanting to take action constantly, doing, thinking about the future, pushing ahead, right? All of these kinds of orientations, whereas too much cold in the system is the opposite. It's stagnation, it's lethargy, it's apathy, it's not caring, it's not being charged up, not having a sense of inspiration, right? To be inspired, full of breath and animated and ready to act. All of these things are a basic example of imbalance in terms of heat and cold. And so when it comes to our personality structures, you actually have this configuration of the system, which is self-perpetuating and will seek to protect itself. So an alchemical, let's say a protocol that is meant to deal with health and illness in this case, like let's say an exercise routine, a different change in diet, etc., is in this way an alchemical formula. It's not necessarily a protocol to optimize or any of this stuff, like that we get. It's like, take these things and do this thing. Here's the regimen, right? It's more like a formula that's coming into the system that is meant to reintegrate different aspects of this multi-layered alchemical process that is you together in order to create a transmutative event that shifts the health, the health and disease state into something else that's more whole, that's more integrated, that is more connected. Yeah. So that is a way to reorientate upon different kinds of exercise regimens, different kinds of ancestral patterns that we work with, different kinds of environmental issues that we're dealing with, cultural patterns, inner splits, karmic layers, all of this stuff we've been talking about. Consider them to be a current configuration of alchemical process that then a regimen or even a set of inner shifts and or both, which is usually required, come in like an alchemical formula to alchemize the system towards greater wholeness and integration. So in this way, the disease is a calling to move towards greater wholeness along one of these layers of being. Well, said more accurately, between all of these layers being. And so in this way, moving on, health, healing, wholeness, all of these things can be thought of as one overall orientation. Yeah. The process of healing is the process of moving towards greater wholeness. And not just you on an individual level, but amongst all of these different layers of your totality, from the ancestral to the cultural to the past life to the present personality. All of it is in this together. Yeah. And in this way, as I said, the disease process is a gift that is intelligent. It doesn't always feel that way, believe me. I'm not saying that it should be easy or that it's like, oh, yay, I'm super sick, so let's have a party about it. It's not my point, believe me. I have dealt with some very serious, very challenging health issues, and I'm not, perfect at this point. It's an ongoing process. But I'm way better than I was at my worst phases on a more regular basis. if that makes sense. I know that's a lot of rhymes right there, but anyway, the point of this being is that we can recognize that, that there's a gift inside the illness, which is really just meant to help us reorientate upon the process and help us carry the difficult aspects with more ease, right? So with that said, illness as a whole and the healing process is asking us to relink the system to this broader orientation, right? We get into cars, we go to our job, we ignore the ancestral layers of our being. We're not paying attention to what's going on inside of us. We've divorced ourselves from what our soul wants to do in life. We're smoking cigarettes to numb ourselves, drinking, eating food that doesn't serve us, all of these things. And each of those orientations are splits, yeah? For if you were to take that person and go, okay, you have to reintegrate with the whole of your ancestry. Oh, wow, that means, all of the things that people say, exercise, eating ancestral food, connecting to a broader sense of meaning and purpose inside the context of service and community, circadian rhythm enhancement. Right there, a bunch of different health challenges typically start to dissolve, right? Not all of them for certain, but you get the solution. So reintegrated there. Then you reintegrate them to their environment. Where are you living? Is your house supportive to you? What do you need to shift around you in order to create a better state of health? If you can, right? Money can obviously play a role. I'm not discounting that there are monetary layers to all of this, but this is not business school. This is talking about health and healing and alchemy. So provided you have the resources, what's your environment doing, right? Then again, reconnect it to the cultural patterns, bringing awareness to that, reintegrate the person and be like, there's all these things that you think are you, but are really just inheritances from a culture that has, imposed itself on you. Then reintegrated that person to past life layers, to, multi-dimensional, spiritual, more shamanic layers of being, karmic layers that might have to be addressed, astrological layers possibly, right? All of these things together. Then, your own personality contending with your own splits and the different imbalances that you live with on a continuous basis. If you were to take most people through a process that involved all of that and then put them through an alchemical process, meaning that they would have to practice, they would have to engage wherever they're at, then you can see the kind of thing we're talking about here in terms of health work as alchemy, because that's what I have done. And what I suggest for people who are very serious about this kind of thing to do is to literally explore and integrate themselves with all of these layers and see what has to be shifted inside of them. And this can coincide with, any of these aspects we've been talking about, including, trauma work. I have a note here for those of you who are listening to this in audio. I'm looking at a slideshow, and the slideshow is only important to help me keep me on track with a talk of this length and magnitude. But one of the notes I have is that most trauma is culturally layered, and that is absolutely true. Because our culture, by its very nature, predisposes us to certain kind of traumatic quote-unquote events, because a lot of trauma, early childhood trauma, comes from family, and a lot of family dynamics in our culture are occurring in modern Western cultures, messed up family dynamics. So right there, that's a huge piece of it, for example. Another piece is expectations, the expectations a culture gives you of what should or should not be, and how the belief that something will be traumatic or that should be traumatic if it occurs to you will affect whether or not it is. People in other cultures may have been way more hardened against events in their lives. So the occurrence of the thing did not necessarily actually create a traumatic feeling for them, but it might for people today. But that's besides the point. So when we take all of these different things together, we realize that the disease will ask us to shift. And this, my friends, is at the core of this talk, and a big part of what I want to express to you is that if we are dealing with a disease state or multiple disease states for that matter, and by disease I just mean that there is a dis-ease. Yeah, it doesn't have to be named. It doesn't have to be a diagnosis. In fact, I think that most diagnoses are largely a kind of curse in a sense that's put on people because it looks at well, let's step back. There's a shamanic principle that says that there are no diseases, there are only sick people. Yeah, which means that it's you that is sick in a sense. And we see this in our culture as not the thing, right? We're like, let's fight cancer, the war on breast cancer, the war on this, etc. Right? There's people are trying to fight this, and one of the things that this asks you to do is to own the fact that a part of you is sick, yeah, and that sick is a kind of, or it is. I mean, not say kind of. It is a calling. It can be a calling to pay attention because we will often not pay attention. We'll continue living the way that we have been in our fragmented state. And so something inside the organisms, inside the being says this has to be addressed. And then we begin to orientate upon that. And then so the being has to change. And the change is you sacrificing versions of yourself at the altar of wholeness. Yeah, it's who you have grown accustomed to be, who you are attached to, the things you are avoiding, what you don't want to do, but that, sorry, reality says you have to do if you want a certain outcome. That's the reality of it. It's so at some level, the alchemical process is one where you're being told in no uncertain terms, this is reality, deal with it, and potentially these are the practices you have to do. So, stepping back, let's say that the greater wholeness, the greater authentic integrity of your system involves a particular set of practices, which could be, let's say, the internal martial arts, or it could be yoga, or it could be dance, or it could be weightlifting, because this is a part of what the true expression of you as an organism, you as a soul, and you as the interface between organism and soul wants to do. It's here to do that for whatever reason, right? And, potential meditative practices, potential traditions that you could engage with, like Ayurveda or Taoism or Lukumi, for example, from Africa, whatever, right? It's just an example. Living in a particular place or potentially living in a different relationship to your environment, what wants to happen at the level of, what the soul came to earth to do, why you're even here, and how your personality is either supporting that work or it's not supporting that work. And all of these kinds of changes, right, where could be held inside the gift of the disease, that the formula to unlock the gift is a deep change of who you are at every level, or at one of these levels, or at multiple of the levels that we've been discussing, that is, in a sense, either temporary, in that eventually that might shift into something else, or permanent. So the disease becomes a catalyst for cultivation. It says, this is happening. What can you even, right? All of these, all these layers. What can you do? What are you being called to do? To shift. What are you being called to become and be? To allow. What are you being asked to let go of and release and adopt? All of that, right? A reconfiguration, a retransmutation of your totality so that the disease unwinds and that you become someone else and at the same time more healthy and more vital, and more, for that matter, whole, integral, and authentically you. So that's how to relate to this. That's the core element of what I mean by the alchemization of health, is that we understand that we're a multi-layered system that is multidimensional as well. It's not just this mechanical, materialized chemical being, right? It's It's a living material, a living materia, a matter that is redeemed, connected with soul, connected with ancestors, connected with culture, connected with environment. Who is an ecosystem with all these different aspects of self that are moving inside of you, that are relating to one another, and that the disease state is an alchemical transmutation that has occurred, that is intelligent and guided by an underlying principle, an underlying intelligence. The thing that leads to health, the intelligence that leads to health inside the body, is the same intelligence that leads to disease. And that system is there to keep the system integral, because otherwise you would be torn apart. And then that healing is a movement towards wholeness that is requiring of practice, requiring of alchemy, requiring of doing and being, of heating something and purifying it and cooling and shaping it and coagulating it and marrying it to other layers, making it beautiful. And that final outcome, that beautified, heated up and purified and cooled down and reshaped thing, you, is the wholeness that's there, the real wholeness, the authentic expression of you. Yeah? So, that is this talk, my friends. There's a lot more that could be said, right? And this method can be applied to very specific people, and honestly, it has to be applied in a very specific way, but that's beyond the scope of this because I don't know who you are and what you're doing, right? So, stay tuned if this was interesting to you, because I will be talking more about these kinds of topics in the future. I have decided that the Living Ancestor Podcast will begin to take this kind of dialogue that relates to health and my healing work, which I've almost kind of always thought was somewhat separate, like a subset of the rest of my work, but I realize really isn't, right? It's a disintegration, right? So we're reintegrating here. And of course, if you appreciate what I do, come check me out at eatingancientvirtue.substack.com. And stay tuned, stay connected. Please join. Give me your email so I can stay in contact with you. I rarely ever send out any kind of ad or anything like that. Mostly it's just, the work that's here to support people like you. All right. Take care, my friends.